Thanks so much for the nice introduction, Loretta, and for having me. So for this talk, really, what I want to do is give an overview of the meat and factory farming industry and its impact on animals and especially the environment, and kind of explain why I think the case for a default plant-based policy is so strong. So like Loretta mentioned, my background is in animal welfare. I worked at different animal welfare nonprofits with a focus on improving the welfare of farm animals in the meat industry. But I came to Vox and, started my career in journalism about 3 years ago. And it's really expanded, my understanding of the impacts of the, industrialized meat system that we have in the US and increasingly around the world. And I've had the opportunity to really hone in on a lot of the environmental impacts. So of course, climate change, but also water pollution and air pollution, and also how it affects people who live near factory farms. And so, for today, I want to give an overview of kind of some of the high level things I've learned, and some of the reasons as to why we have this system and how it perpetuates, even though we understand it's not good for animals, it's not good for the environment. In many ways, it's not good for us. And then some things that people are doing, like default plant-based food, to try to remedy some of these problems. And so I do have some bullet points with me here just to make sure I'm not missing anything. So if you see me glancing over it somewhere on the screen, I'm not looking at Twitter. I'm trying to stay on topic and give an overview of what I've learned and kind of where I'm coming from. So I think the first thing that I want to share, and again, this is something that I learned only because I had the opportunity to really dig into it and write an article about it at Vox, is just a very brief history of factory farming in the US and how it's come to pollute our waterways and air. And so this may not come as a surprise to anyone, but the food industry has undergone a really dramatic shift over the last century. Before the 1920s, most food was produced on small farms. Most people lived on, or not most, but a significant percent of the US population actually lived on a farm, and maybe they grew food and raised animals for themselves, for their communities, for small markets near them. And that wasn't exactly a perfect system. It had its own flaws, but it meant that meat was kind of more of a delicacy. Nowadays, a lot of people might eat meat 2 or 3 times a day, but back then it might have been something where you only ate meat a few times a week. And so thus it had a much lighter carbon footprint, and there were just far fewer animals raised, and they weren't factory farmed. But everything really started to change in the 1920s and the 1930s. And so there were a number of things changing in American society that gave way to it. So the biggest thing was the discovery of antibiotics. Farmers began to learn that you could keep a lot of animals closely together if you proactively fed them antibiotics. Because when farmers tried to do that pre-1920s, the disease rate was so high. So when you had so many animals tightly packed together, a lot of them would prematurely die. And so it just wasn't, cost effective to do that. But when you could proactively give them antibiotics, they could live longer and more easily fend off disease. So then you started to see this shift in American farming where they started to bring animals indoors, keep thousands, eventually tens of thousands together in single barns. And around this time, you also saw advances in agricultural refrigeration and transportation. You saw the rise of chain grocery stores, the rise of agricultural financing from banks and the government, and all of this kind of combined to create the industrialized factory farm system that we have today in the US, which is, predominant in Europe and is quickly expanding to the rest of the world. And has an enormous carbon footprint, but also water footprint as well. And so just for context, I think a lot of people are surprised when they hear these numbers, but today in the United States, we eat about 265 pounds of meat a year, each person, which translates to about 25 land animals. Most of those are chickens. And that doesn't even include fish. If you add in fish, each consumer might have dozens of fish, even hundreds, depending on where they live and they have a taste for fish. And while we eat more meat than any other country, the rest of the world is kind of quickly catching up. Economic growth across Africa, Asia, and Latin America means that they're adopting more Western lifestyles. And so while the, carbon footprint, the food carbon footprint of people around the world is relatively small, it's really quickly growing. And so I want to, that's kind of the context, a 3-minute summary of the birth of factory farming in the United States and how it began to spread around the world. And just very briefly, I want to kind of give a description of what life is like for these animals, and then I'll talk about the environmental effects of it. So in the United States, virtually all animals are factory farmed, and it's pretty much the same in Europe, as I mentioned, maybe a little lower rates in Europe. And, the US model of factory farming is spreading around the world, where essentially you're putting thousands or tens of thousands of animals who've been bred to grow really quickly, to grow bigger and faster, which causes a number of welfare issues as well. And a lot of these animals, horrific things are done to them. I won't go into too much detail since I know we're kind of focusing more on the environmental aspect. And these issues are, predominant.
Yeah, I can just blank the screen and eat while I'm listening.
Oh, yeah, that works. Well, and yes, so these conditions are, predominant across the United States and increasingly around the world. And it has an enormous carbon footprint. Often when we think of climate change, of course, our first thought is fossil fuels for energy production. And that is the #1 cause of climate change. But not far behind is production of meat, dairy, and eggs, which globally accounts for around 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Some estimates put it closer to 20%. I tend to use a more conservative figure of around 15%. Different models have come to different conclusions. Some say 16, some say 17, but I stick with around 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. And there's 3 main ways that meat and dairy production produce greenhouse gas emissions that accelerate climate change. So the first is cows and cattle, raised for beef and dairy. When they chew on grass, when they eat, grain at the feedlot, they will, in their stomachs, the grass ferments and creates methane, which is a highly potent greenhouse gas. And so they burp it out, goes into the atmosphere. Secondly is that farmed animal manure, whether it's cows or pigs or chickens, has high levels of nitrous oxide, which is even more potent than methane. And then lastly, these animals, the 77 billion animals, land animals raised for food each year, eat a lot of food. And so a lot about, actually, sorry, I don't know this stat off the top of my head, but it's a very significant portion of the world's ice-free land is dedicated either to cattle grazing or to growing, whether it's soy or corn or sorghum or barley or wheat, to feed livestock. And growing all of that corn and soy requires a lot of fertilizer, and that fertilizer has nitrogen, which contributes to climate change. And so those are kind of the three main ways that the huge number of animals we raise for food contribute to climate change. But I'll also add that climate change isn't the only environmental issue that comes as a result of industrialized animal factory farming. So there's also the problem of deforestation. And so a lot of times when you might read about deforestation in the Amazon, you maybe think it's, because of timber or for clearing land for, housing. But really the main issue is for cattle grazing or for growing livestock feed. Around 80% of Amazon deforestation is directly tied to meat production. And here at home in the United States, it's the leading cause of water pollution, and it's also a leading cause of air pollution. And I'll get into in a moment, I'll get into how that's become the case. And so, add this all together, and leading climate scientists have been saying for years that we're not going to be able to meet, the Paris climate agreement without significant reductions in meat and dairy consumption, and especially in rich countries where per capita consumption is just so much higher than in lower and middle income countries. And another thing that I'll point out too is that we're in this situation in which, thankfully, due to the Inflation Reduction Act, the United States is finally starting to take some serious action in addressing climate change and emissions from, vehicles, cars, and energy production by huge investments in electric vehicles, heat pumps, renewable forms of energy. But there's this concern among food and agricultural researchers that because we're not really investing in reducing emissions from agriculture, it could be the case that by 2050, the #1 cause of US emissions could be what we eat, not how we get our energy. Environmental Working Group has done, some interesting analysis on this. And so it's this problem where, because we're not taking action on emissions in ag, while we are taking action on emissions in energy production, we could start to see the pie chart around, US emissions start to shift. And, in 1, 2, 3 generations, food production could be the #1 climate issue in the US. And so I think it's worth, that's kind of the problem at a high level, but I want to step back and try to answer the question of how did things get to be so bad, and why are there no checks and balances on ag emissions in the US? And so I recently wrote an article where I got to dive into this, and I learned a lot. And so I kind of want to share some of what I learned there, especially the environmental angle of it. So in the I'll call it the food reform sector, there's this term that has been increasingly used called agricultural exceptionalism. And it's this idea that because food is so important, obviously it's critical to our survival as a species, that agricultural operations should be exempt from the kinds of regulations that other industries are not exempt from. And so just as a few examples, you have the US Federal Animal Welfare Act, which covers some species of animals, but it exempts food animals. Same goes on the state level. Pretty much every state has an anti-cruelty law, but all of those anti-cruelty laws exempt farm animals or exempt farming practices. Also at the federal level, you have the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, but these largely exempt factory farms, or what the USDA calls CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations. You also have, every state has what's called a right to farm law, which essentially makes it impossible for someone to sue a farm with with a nuisance lawsuit. So for example, I've talked to a lot of people who live next to a factory farm who say it smells terrible. It's made it just a nightmare to live here. I can't spend any time outdoors, because of all the manure. There's constantly flies swarming around my house. But legally, there's almost nothing they can do because their state has what's called a right to farm law, which makes it impossible to sue over these kinds of environmental nuisances. And a lot of this came to be because big ag is incredibly powerful in a way that I think a lot of people don't quite appreciate. I mean, one analysis that came out a couple of years ago found that by share of their revenue, Tyson Foods spends a larger percent of its revenue than ExxonMobil on blocking climate policy. And you can see this both at the federal and the state level, where farmers have just an incredible amount of influence, farmers and the trade associations that represent them, and meat producers have an incredible amount of power in the agricultural committees at the federal and state level, to a point where it's practically impossible to pass new legislation to regulate, whether it's animal cruelty issues or water pollution or air pollution. I did a deep dive into Nebraska, where environmental advocates have just been so incredibly frustrated because at every level of state and local government, where there are supposed to be checks and balances on water pollution from chicken farms, from pork farms, from cattle ranches, a lot of those same farmers that are polluting the water and air are they sit on the local water boards that are supposed to clean up the water. In fact, the governor of Nebraska is one of the country's largest pork producers. And he's consistently said there's no way we're going to have, environmental regulations for farms here in Nebraska, which is one of the leading, chicken and beef states. So that leads to the question of, well, what can be done if this problem is widespread and yet there are almost no regulations or checks and balances put into place? So one thing I'll say is that there are a lot of incredible, advocates and people doing work to try to raise awareness about these issues and to try to change things at the USDA, at the EPA, at the state equivalents of these agencies. There's a lot of people trying to advocate for change at the corporate level. So trying to get companies to commit to, say, serving more plant-based foods or to coming up with plant-based products as a replacement. There's also been a lot of progress at the state level to try to ban some of the most inhumane practices for farm animals. But I also think, what the conclusion I often reach is that there's also going to need to be a lot more kind of local change done on this issue. So whether that looks like changing the cafeteria options at getting like college students changing what is served at their cafeteria, or people getting things changed at what is served at their workplace's cafeteria, or what you all are trying to do with looking at how can we change some of the food policies at our congregation's events so that we don't have this default where meat is always the first thing on the menu. It's like if you go to a wedding, it's always, do you want chicken or salmon? And then if you want the vegetarian option, you have to request it, and it's maybe doesn't taste that good. But there's been a growing movement to kind of acknowledge that, well, maybe we need to kind of flip it and say the default policy is the default dish is plant-based. And if you want something that's meat-based, you have to request it. And so this is a way to maybe not raise people's defenses understandably, it's food preferences are baked in. They're really difficult to change. And I can speak to that from my own experience. I grew up eating meat, dairy, and eggs 3 times a day. I think those foods are delicious. I've been vegan for a long time, but I often try to tell people, this is not an all or nothing thing. People can often turn it into that as either, I'm a vegan or I'm a carnivore who is eating steak, for every single meal. But I think it's important that we acknowledge that the amount of meat, dairy, and eggs we're eating in the US is abnormal. It's more than any other country. It's more than any other society in human history. And it's having really serious consequences on the environment. And there are a lot of simple things that we can do to change that. And so there's been some really inspiring work that's been done on with this idea of default plant-based. And so one example is New York City hospitals. So, New York City runs a number of its own hospitals. Of course, there are private hospitals, but it also runs a number of its own. And they've had this really successful program where they've made kind of the default cafeteria options or options that patients can order as plant-based. And if you want, a meat-based dish, you might have to request it, or maybe if there are 5 options, only one has meat. I'm not sure on the specifics of, New York City's hospital policy, but that's an example where they're kind of flipping the script. Usually it's the opposite. If there are 5 dishes, maybe one is vegetarian. Here they're doing the opposite, where only one is meat-based. And there's also been some interesting experiments. There's a group called Greener by Default. I don't know if you all have heard of them. They're doing really good work. I'd be happy to connect you with them if you haven't yet. They, on their website, they have an example of an experiment that was done at a conference where, they basically asked people, or they made the default food option when you registered as a conference attendee to be plant-based. And you could request a meat-based dish if you wanted. And the effect that had, that simple option change, made it so that before they did this, only 7% of the attendees ate a plant-based meal. But when they made this default switch, it was around 80% of attendees ate a plant-based meal, even though they still had the option of getting a meat-based one. Another interesting example, I don't know if anyone is familiar with this. I don't know if we have this chain in the DC area. I'm in Silver Spring, by the way. I forgot to mention that. I know most people here are in Northern Virginia. But there's a coffee chain called Blue Bottle, and they've said that to do our part to try to address the climate crisis, we're going to make the default milk option oat milk. And if you want cow's milk, you have to request it. But by default, if you're ordering a coffee at Blue Bottle, it's going to have oat milk or another kind of plant-based milk. And lastly, I know I'm close to time here, but the company LinkedIn, they have a number of offices, and they've actually kind of run some experiments in some of their office cafeterias where they have made the majority of their dishes at their cafeteria plant-based. And they found that it drastically, increased the amount of plant-based food that was consumed at their cafeterias, while there were still meat-based options if people wanted those. And so I think this is a really, exciting and important way to, shift people's habits without forcing something on them, and exposing people to new kinds of foods, and to help people eat in a more climate-friendly way that's really welcoming and incremental. And so I'm excited that you all are working on that. And I think there's a lot of precedent to what you're doing, and a lot of people have shown that this is possible and doable, and most importantly, actually has an impact. It helps people eat more plant-based foods, which are better for the environment. So I want to leave some time for questions. I know I've covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. But yeah, thank you all for being here with me today. And yeah, Loretta, let's open it up to questions if that works.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a wonderful history and a really fascinating point about how I knew the animal or the food industry had a tremendous lobby, but you really made it clear that we each have the opportunity to counter their effect through things like the default plant-based food policy. If we can't wait for the legislation, this is something we can do now. But what, should we just, anyone who has a question, if you just want to raise your hand, and Annie could answer that. No questions to start. Maybe what we could do is, Tanya, may I ask you to give us, River Road has adopted a default plant-based food policy. And maybe it would be helpful, Tanya, if you could tell us a little bit about how that was adopted and how that's been going and the impact. Because the other thing, I think New York hospitals, their greenhouse gases were reduced by 33 or 36%. There was a study that the Better Food Foundation reported on the college campuses where their food greenhouse gases were reduced 23% through the way. And there, as Kenny pointed out, there are different ways to structure a default plant-based food policy. So, Tanya, are you?
Hi, sorry, my lighting's not great, but well, I know I've talked with some of you kind of about how this happened at River Road, but probably not all of you, so I'll give a brief overview. We actually kind of stumbled onto this when we were talking within our animal ministry group about the fact that this was several years ago, just prior to COVID, that the youth had served a dinner that I believe the proceeds were even designated towards some sort of climate change effort. And they had served chicken. And one of our members said, I'd really like to write a letter to the board to say, to point out that this is a bit of a conflicting message. Oh, please, honey. Sorry, I had my bird out and I had me on mute. And that he wanted our group to basically say that we should not be serving any meat at all, which our group, as our personal ethics, would be in favor of, but we were very concerned that that would not be well received. And so we were kind of talking about how to best try to move us in that direction while still having a message that would be well received. And my own background is in psychology and behavior change. And, we use the term optimal defaults in terms of a variety of health behaviors, whether that be saving for retirement or opting in or out of organ donation or things like that. So I was familiar with that terminology and said, maybe we could apply that to our situation, because the congregation already always offers at least a vegetarian and usually a vegan option anytime we have a meal. And so why don't we just make the recommendation that we flip that? So we prepared a little brief, I think we were limited to 3 minutes when you go, I guess make a presentation to the board. So we prepared a little one-pager describing the impact of animal agriculture on climate, and noting that, as part of the Green Sanctuary effort, our congregation was wanting to adopt initiatives that would promote environmental change, and so that this would be in line with it. We had no idea how it would be received. We really, as a group, we had done things like have what we call compassionate coffee hour, where we served vegan snacks and things like that, but we had not had really any plant-based initiatives beyond kind of the work of our own small group. But apparently the timing was just right because the board was open to it. It was kind of put as an initiative for consideration as we move forward toward the green sanctuary work. And it ended up passing and didn't get put to the test then until after we started returning after COVID. It was literally the February before all the shutdowns that we went before the board. And so then when we started resuming activities after COVID, or there's no after, but anyway, after the major aspects of it, one of the first major activities was our congregational retreat, which is an outdoor retreat, a one-day event. And so they approached our group and said, well, we're willing to do the plant-based default. Can your organization plan and serve our meal? And so then we had a quick discussion amongst ourselves of, gee, none of us want to grill meat. What do we do? And I volunteered my spouse, who is an omnivore, to do the grilling of the meat so that we could still offer both options as we had proposed. And then the folks planning the retreat said, oh, no, you don't need to serve meat. We can make it all plant-based, and if someone wants meat, they can bring it themselves. So we have had excellent success with very little conflict or complaint. People love the meal. We've done it twice now. We have also, when there have been other events, we have had to pretty much remind folks every time that this is something that was adopted, and people have been very willing to make the plant-based option the default option. So, we have not tried to push for being 100% plant-based, but simply to make it the predominant theme of whatever the event is, whatever is being served.
That is terrific. And my understanding is you're writing kind of guidelines for actually implementing it. And
Yeah.
you're in the process of doing that. How's that going?
That's fine. We're kind of struggling a little bit with how detailed to make those, how prescriptive to make them, what's going to be useful. I think in the end, what's going to be helpful is less about specific guidelines and more about suggestions, resources, etc. So when there's a brunch for new members, what are some recommendations for where to get the food or things to make or stuff like that. So I think we are probably going to expand to include some of those kinds of things, because really the guidelines are pretty straightforward. Make the main offering 100% plant-based. This is what 100% plant-based means. Label anything that isn't, to put it very briefly.
Mm-hmm. That is terrific and a great model to follow. And I see two hands up, but there's a comment from Tom Bentley in the chat that they suggested having all vegan options at a single event for a new minister who is vegan. People freaked out and were very upset. This was one event only. Kenny or Tanya, I wonder if either of you would have suggestions or comments for a situation like that.
Well, Tanya, thanks for sharing your story. That was really inspiring to hear, and I'm glad it's worked out. And I've told the Red of this, but I've been to many. I know Tara Brock has, I believe Tara Brock has stopped doing them, but I've been to many of her Dharma talks at UU River Road. I actually used to live in Friendship Heights, and it's just such a beautiful place. Well, yeah, Tanya might have a better response or more insight than me for Tom. I think, well, I'd be curious to hear, maybe Tom could share more if you'd like, about why exactly people were freaking out and upset. I mean, I can imagine why, but it can be very frustrating too to be in this position, because I think if you were to say, hey, I think our building should only use renewable energy, I think people would be pretty open-minded to that. But the minute you talk about food choices, people can get their defenses up, and it's really hard to take them down. And so I think maybe that's why the default plant-based policy can be successful, because I mean, this new minister who's vegan, I think I'd hope that people out of respect would say, yeah, we'll sit down and have a vegan meal with you. But I think that goes to show just how difficult it is to make progress on this issue. And so, yeah, it might be the case that even when you're trying to welcome your new minister who's vegan, maybe it's worth making it more of a default plant-based kind of situation where most of the dishes available are vegan, but some are not.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would also say I'd love to hear a little more from Mark about what the freak out looked like. I might make some guesses that people interpreted it as a judgmental message of anything else is wrong, or we might have to eat this way all the time, or people make a lot of assumptions about eating plant-based that result in it being a very threatening thought for them. That it must mean that I'm a bad person if I'm eating any meat, or someone's trying to get me to be a vegan and I don't want to do that. And we've really worked hard to try to be embracing and welcoming of any movement toward plant-based without judgment, because we don't want to put up any barriers to people making those changes, as particularly cognitive barriers that they tend to have whether we say anything or not. By virtue of the fact that I choose to eat vegan, someone else will assume that I am therefore saying that their ethics are less than. And given that hold very strongly to being ethical, compassionate, socially just people, simply the behavior of making a choice to eat vegan or 100% plant-based can imply that someone else is being less ethical, even if I say nothing to that extent.
Excellent points. Yes, thank you, both of you. So go in order, Paul.
Sorry, I had to unmute. Yeah, I'm glad Tom entered that comment in there, because that goes to the question that I had when I heard Tanya talking about how they implemented their default plant-based policy. And I thought what I heard Tanya say was that you decided, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically, you're welcome to bring your meat option here, but we won't be providing it. Is that correct, Tonya?
Yes, what we propose to the board is that when a meal is served, the plant-based meal would be the default. So if nobody makes a special request, they get the plant-based, but they would have the option to request a meat-based meal. So it's basically just flipping what the congregation used to do, where when you register for a meal, you would get the meat-based meal unless you say, I want a vegan or vegetarian meal. So basically we said, let's flip that. And then as it was implemented at the retreat committee actually said we didn't even need to offer that by request meat, that we would just tell people if they wanted to eat meat, they could bring their own.
Okay, so that's interesting, because UUs, in my experience, are not shrinking violets by any means. I mean, if there's something a UU doesn't like, a UU usually says something about that. And and you said that you really had no significant pushback on going all the way to, we're not offering it even as an option unless you bring it yourself. You're welcome to bring it yourself. I wanted to also ask Kenny, because maybe he's had more contacts with other people who have implemented a flipping of the default, so the way you described it, Kenny, was instead of 5 meat options and 1 plant-based option, it's the reverse. Has there been, have you heard about pushback on that, and what does the pushback look like? I'm interested in hearing also what Tom said the freak out looked like also.
Yeah, I'll keep it short and kick it over to Tom. I haven't talked too deeply with, I mean, I know some of the folks who work at Greener by Default, and I know one of the people who works on New York City's food policy program, but I don't think the response has been too negative, especially if there is that one option that's still available, or two, or 1 or 2, whatever percentage it is of the whole. So yeah, I can't speak, too much to how some of the main experiments have gone, but my impression is that they're generally positive. I'm sure there's been some pushback here and there, but not to the point where it seems like it's a big, failure or anything. So yeah, I'll kick it over to Tom, since you had asked to hear about his experience.
Thank you.
All right. So can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm just using my phone, so I wanted to make sure everything was working right. So this was several years ago. It was about 5 years ago. It might even be longer than that now. It was definitely before COVID. And this was shortly after the new minister was picked and, settled in. And we were doing an event. Just to give a little bit more details, we were just doing a sort of a welcoming the night before the first Sunday that she would be being our minister. So the suggestion was actually made by an omnivore who was organizing this event. So it wasn't coming from someone who was vegan or even vegetarian. She was aware of trying to do more plant-based eating, but she was it was just a single event. So to get into the reactions, if I can remember them sufficiently, is people were probably having that somewhat typical response of you're saying something bad about me by how you're suggesting we should eat now. But there were emails saying going to the general group. I can't, essentially, I can't believe we're doing this. I don't know why I have to give up what I would normally eat. So what's exciting for me, many years later, in being reminded about, plant-based by default and various other efforts that are going on, is that it might now be time for me and others to try to take that approach and see what happens. Because over the years, things have gotten more relaxed. A lot of the meals that people bring to events are now vegan. Now that we're doing more stuff in person again. Even when we weren't, we were providing meals for that you could come pick up for some special events. And there were always options that were vegan, and many people who were not vegan actually select them now, which is great to see. But I would personally like to, take another stab at doing something that's a bit more, especially since, I've done some good presentations that, were reasonably well attended through our environmental action group that we have around food and the environment. And, people are really starting to think about how that, even if you put aside how animals are treated in industrial agriculture, there's still a large effect on the environment, and as we all know, things need to be done. So they're much more interested in how they can make changes. And those presentations I've given, hearkening back to a comment, I'm not sure exactly who made it. I made a big effort to not make it wrong to eat things that weren't plant-based, and just give them an overview of how, if you just stop eating beef, you look at this chart, the environmental impacts of beef alone, and you move down to some of these things that are lower down on the list, which included, cheese and chicken and fish and various things like that, you're now doing it better for the environment. Instead of taking it less off of, the choices around food and animal rights and, animal agriculture, or food choices around that kind of thing, making it more about the environment, which I think also is more readily received.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Is your minister still there? Your vegan minister?
Yes, she's still here, and it's still awesome to have her here. So,
Well, great. Thank you.
you're welcome.
Eric, you had a question.
Well, actually, what I'd like to do is kind of facilitate or pump it back to you, Loretta. If you could just talk about the difference in the reaction of our minister when we shifted from talking about a plant-based default or vegan to a more, our most recent meeting with him. I was wondering if you could kind of comment about that. And one little anecdote that I would love to put in here is as part of ACT's plan for the year, we were presenting what are all the things that we would like to do to help bring the congregation more towards the default policy. And one of the things that we discussed was having ACT offer for our hypothermia project, which is homeless people who stay at our church, and we provide meals and housing for a week, that we provide a plant-based dinner for them. And our minister said, "Oh, well, I don't know that we can do that." And Loretta's comment was, "Well, we've done it for the last 2 years."
No, not the last year. We've done it twice.
You've done it twice. Sorry, you've done it twice. And not only was there no objection, but there was somebody who commented they wanted to know about the chili that was being prepared for them. And when Loretta was able to reassure them that it was plant-based, they said, "Oh, good, then I can have it." But if you could just say a little bit about the difference in reception from the minister about the talking about plant default.
And not just the minister, there are other people even on this call, like Paul, who shifted too. For years, ACT, we've been trying to promote the plant-based eating, and all of our events have been all plant-based. Not a default, but just all plant-based, and they've been well received. Potlucks, people brought the plant-based, and they've gone over very well. And so my attitude, being a passionate vegan and an ethical vegan, was to really push for, let's do that. We've done it at our meetings. Why can't we do it congregation wide? And there was a lot of pushback. So there's this book, How to Create a Vegan World. I can't think of his name. Michael, it's on the table with you. But he talked about how with gluten-free foods, now years ago, if people had celiac disease or some other illnesses and couldn't eat gluten, there weren't many options. But now there's a proliferation. But it wasn't just the people with celiac. It was all of the people with sensitivities and who just wanted the gluten-free, but didn't have to eat gluten-free all the time. And so he equated that with actually, thank you. It's the How to Create a Vegan World, a Pragmatic Approach by Tobias Leinart. And so he used that same thinking for plant-based. And his whole approach is, let's, promote more plant-based eating to, and decrease our animal consumption. because that's going to actually result in more, you know, environmental impact, saving more animals, better health, you know, just all around. So when we shifted to that approach, as we approached our, you know, minister, Reverend David, he actually helped us strategize the plan that we have presented to the community, to the congregation. Whereas he was not a real big fan before, and he still doesn't, you know, he's not going out and speaking on our behalf, but he helped us, and that was just wonderful. And that's what we want. We want to encourage everyone to help, to be a part. You know, every small action that reduces our animal consumption and increases the plant-based consumption has impact. It's wonderful. No one is perfect. You know, and we can't let perfection be the enemy of progress. So, and I'm seeing comments, similar interest in our neighborhood supper. Yeah, it's really letting people, you know, have options, but making that default. You know, making it at our picnic, the last congregational picnic, there was a long table of hamburgers and hot dogs and salads, and then there was a separate table that said special diets. And on that special diets table in the corner, you had gluten-free, you had vegetarian, and you had vegan. We would like to see that main table be plant-based and that smaller table be the hot dogs, hamburgers, animal-based foods. So Michael, you had a comment. Eric, did that answer your question? Yeah, okay. Michael?
I kind of like to respond to Tom's giving us the example of that they had early on with the bad reactions to the dinner. To my mind, and I don't know the details, so maybe I'm all wet on this, but perhaps the problem there and the problem that has to be avoided with this kind of thing is catching people by surprise and saying, oh yeah, by the way, the dinner next week is going to be all vegan, but you can bring something else if you like. I really think it's important that the approach we're taking here is the one that is, I think, is going to be the most advantageous, and that is to give people plenty of opportunity to explore what exactly is being proposed, and then an opportunity to comment on it one way or the other. And then, since we're UUs, the opportunity to vote it up or vote it down for the congregation. And I think if you don't allow people those opportunities, you're not going to have much success. Just my feeling.
Thank you. And I'm seeing the time, and I'm seeing that Kenny has to log off soon. And I can't thank you enough, Kenny. This was so informative and inspiring. And I hope everyone will come to Vox and look at your newsletter and take advantage of all the resources. And I hope you go out and you preach and teach and share your wisdom with the world. And thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thanks so much for having me. And Loretta, yeah, I hope to meet you in person at one of Alex's next events. And yeah, I don't want to stop the discussion. It's been very fruitful. I just have to log off because I have to go have a plant-based meal myself and do a little work before the night ends. But yeah, keep the conversation going. Don't mind me. And yeah, thanks again for having me. And I look forward to hearing how the campaign develops over time.
We'll keep you posted. Thanks so much, Kenny.
Great. Bye, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.
Good night. And if anyone else has any comments or any concerns, you know, if you know, you're hearing things that are concerning you, we really do want to hear that too.
I had one thought, Loretta, and I loved all the bullet points that Kenny gave us for, you know, the vegan eating and we know about climate change and the impact on climate with raising animals. The one thing that I kind of want to flip around is we all make changes when we see the immediate benefit and we experience the benefit. And so I guess I'd also like to consider, you know, what's in it for me, not me personally, because you sold me a long time ago, but what can we say to people? This is what you're going to experience when you eat, try this, you know, for a week or whatever. We know about inflammation. We know about the benefits of not raising animals in the inhumane way, but what else can we focus on that will personally benefit individuals, that will kind of help sell them on the idea? Yes, it's great for the climate and for the, you know, the greater good, but sometimes people need to see, well, how is it going to benefit me personally? And so those might be some things that we can add to our repertoire of bullet points that we can use.
Excellent. Would anyone like to comment on your own experience of how a vegan diet has benefited? I know for myself, I got my cholesterol down to normal by a whole plant-based food, and also cleared out some of my arteries, you know, some improvement in clogged arteries. And, you know, there's an awful lot of research. In fact, we do have a recording. Maybe we could share that again of Dr. Ted Barnett from the Rochester Lifestyle Institute talking about food as medicine. Ed, would you like to? Ed? I think you had
I think actually I got into eating plant-based more because of health, which is a terrific benefit, and it's astounding how beneficial it is. Joel Furman and others have said that heart disease, our biggest killer, 700,000 people a year die from it, can be reduced by over 100-fold. And I kind of picked around some research. It's a phenomenal claim. And I kind of picked around some research outside of what Furman himself wrote, and it does appear to be true. There are claims frequently made that are not that high, but it does seem like if you go to a whole food plant-based diet, vegan doesn't necessarily cut the mustard, because you know, Oreos and Pepsi Colas are vegan. But if you do whole foods and plant-based, the health benefits are incredible. Even things like autoimmune diseases and multiple sclerosis have been reported. So terrific benefits there, of course. And I think it's cheaper. I've heard the other opposite argument, but you know, from my experience, it's less expensive. So.
Yeah,
anyway.
Ed, do you want to plug your book discussion?
Pardon me?
Would you like to plug your book discussion?
Oh, I guess I should. Yeah, we're doing a little book discussion. I hope most of you have been know about it, but it's one of Joel Furman's books called Fast Food Genocide, and it is about the horrific effects of fast food on folks who live in food deserts, and so it's really good. And so please join us.
Yeah, I'll send out the sign up link again. So thank you. And Tom Ruby, you had your hand up.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, I'm sorry, I forgot to join here at 7, but I got the last 45 minutes of Kenny's presentation, and it was very good. And I would just like to, I go to the UU Church at Mount Vernon Unitarian Church. And we've had dinners with vegan, vegetarian meals. And my comment is simply that converting people is a process. It's important to realize it's a process. Processes in our culture don't happen overnight. They take time. I mean, we're in a cohort here of people who can remember probably when they didn't have seatbelts to wear. And then you had to wear them, and people fussed up and down. I was one of them. Wearing helmets on a bicycle. I didn't like that one either, but now I do. Drinking, instead of drinking milk, now I drink soy milk. That was a process. And when you're talking about an entire country, it's like I equate it to moving from cars that use fossil fuels to cars that don't use fossil fuels. It's a process of moving people from that to the electric cars, let's say. So my point is that you shouldn't expect people to become, even Kenny said he grew up eating meat. And you can't expect people, especially in our age group, and I was one of them, grew up on a farm, we had meat all the time, to just give that up at the snap of a finger. But if it, for me, I think it's an educational process. And that takes time, and you just keep preaching that same word. Eat vegan, eat vegetarian. Here's your options, and just make that equal, just make that discussion very common. And sooner or later, especially the UUs, will pick up on it. And then, Loretta, like you just said, they might start seeing benefits, physical benefits from eating that way. And then the word spreads one to one person to another person, and then eventually the whole church is eating that away, and that affects the community around the churches. so that's my thoughts on the subject.
Well, that's exactly our theme this year is beyond our walls, and we want to go beyond our walls, and this is a way to do it. It's great for us individually. I also lost a lot of weight with this too. Not trying to lose weight, but as a side effect of the healthy diet. So we can get lots more information about the personal benefits, certainly for the climate, definitely for the animals and our UU values. And so I thank you all for being here and hanging in past our time, and look forward. We're going to be having town halls, and we'll be having more programs and discussions. So again, thank you, and we welcome any feedback or comments after. So enjoy the night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Thanks, Loretta.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.